Of all the many Android smartphone makers out there, Samsung has always been one of the most successful, but there's really no question that the early 2010s seem to be their glory days, with basically every big phone release selling absurdly well. The amount of sales generated from phones like the Galaxy S3, S4, and S5 haven't been met by any individual Galaxy since, although Samsung is most definitely still a behemoth in the marketplace with their wide array of both budget and premium devices for each and every price point. But if you're a longtime Samsung fan, you might remember a time when very few smartphones ruled the market, when it wasn't simply just Android versus Apple, but it seemed to be more specifically Samsung Galaxy versus iPhone, and the Galaxy S3 and S3 Mini selling a combined 70 million units, nearly doubled the 40 million sales of the S2, firmly planting Samsung as the Android smartphone brand in the minds and pockets of consumers. The early 2010s were a crazy time in the smartphone world, as everyone looked to upgrade from the flip phones of the past, and there may be no device more identifiable with the era than this 2012 smartphone. Hey, how's it going? I'm Josh from 91 Tech, and believe it or not, the Samsung Galaxy S3 is nearly a full decade old. Why did it sell so well, and how does it hold up today? It's always amusing to me how older Samsungs both simultaneously look significantly more modern than the iPhones they were competing with, but also older and cheaper, with the mix of the big gorgeous display contrasted by the cheaper glossy plastic the company was once known for. Everyone has their own opinions on plastic smartphones, but it's a no doubt less premium material that puts functionality over form, and whether or not you find that to be a good or bad thing is pretty much down to personal preference. For me, the glass of the iPhone 4S and aluminum of the iPhone 5 from around the same time period completely blow the S3 out of the water when it comes to looks and design. But at the same time, if I had to choose a phone to use today, it would be kinda tough not to go for the S3 with its much larger display that helps the phone feel a whole lot more modern when you're actually using it, even if the software is extremely dated. This specific S3 I have here, I actually bought last year brand new and even did an unboxing of it. I'll link that in the description. I'm a little late to finally do this review, but better late than never, and ever since purchasing the S3, I've actually been impressed. The Galaxy S3 sold 70 million units for a reason. Well, multiple reasons really, and it was easily the biggest name Android phone of 2012. Again, if you were looking to buy a smartphone, it wasn't so much Android versus Apple as it was iPhone versus Samsung Galaxy, and while it's pretty nostalgic for me to reflect on those early smartphone wars, the variety of choice we have nowadays with so many great options in the market is most certainly preferable. Not that there weren't other great Androids in the early 2010s, but none of them were nearly as iconic or sold as well as both iPhones and Galaxies did. So let's start this off with the reason that S3 was so appealing: the large, lovely, and for the time ludicrous display. Yeah, ludicrous. The Galaxy S2 featured 4.3 inches, which was large enough, but a 4.8 inch screen on the S3 was really darn big for the time period, especially compared to the best iPhone out in early 2012 with the 3.5 inch iPhone 4S. Don't forget, 2012 wasn't too far removed from the days of flip phones, a time where each phone was doing its best to continue getting smaller and more compact year over year. Samsung with the S3, S4, and Note series would really kick off the phablet trend, which has continued over the past decade to the point where all these huge phones aren't even called phablets anymore. They're just phones, as we've all gotten used to the ridiculous sizes. The 4.8 inch Super AMOLED display on the S3 features a resolution of 720 by 1280, making for a great for the time pixel density of 306 pixels per inch in a form factor that gave a widescreen aspect ratio of 16:9, providing a much more modern experience than the 3:2 iPhone 4S, which was more square. The 306 pixels per inch was one of the best numbers ever achieved at the time, but it was still slightly behind Apple's Retina display, something Samsung would both match and surpass altogether the next year with the Galaxy S4. But what the S3 did have was superior display technology, or in the very least, the one that would prove to be the future with their Super AMOLED instead of IPS LCD. With AMOLED, the display doesn't have to light up the entire screen at once, but is instead able to turn on individual pixels, which makes for a much more vibrant and colorful viewing experience, as you get true blacks and much richer tones in general. Of course, it wasn't as cut and dry as I've made it sound here. Back in the day, the Galaxy screens were always heavily criticized for looking oversaturated, especially compared to the more realistic feeling colors of iPhone, phone, and while I do agree that the coloring is a bit much here, the screen really pops and it's easy to see the appeal. The OLED might be ahead of its time, but it also did hurt the durability factor, as burn-in is unfortunately all too common. Burn-in is basically when remnants of old images are burned into the screen, staying there forever. That being said, because I bought my S3 brand new, it's absolutely flawless, and as long as you were careful not to leave the screen on too long, it's totally doable to keep it in good condition. The overall design of the S3 actually does make for a pretty durable phone, thanks to the glossy plastic not being nearly as fragile as the glass Apple used with the iPhone 4S. The plastic back is pretty cheap looking, I will admit. Perhaps this was standard in 2012, but comparing it to an iPhone from the same time, well, one is premium and one isn't, and that's honestly okay. The S3 wasn't necessarily trying to be a direct competitor with iPhone. I mean, it was, but to rephrase here, it wasn't trying to be an iPhone. It was its own thing, a phone that featured as much of the Android goodness as possible, with all the accessibility and customizability that Android can come with. I'm not really a fan of the design from a look standpoint, but it all comes down to individual preferences. And that being said, I do have to say that frame is quite tacky. You might be wondering why I would say that, as the metal seemingly contrasts quite nicely with the glossy plastic, but as it so happens, that frame isn't metal at all, but is instead just painted plastic. I'll say at least it's not as deceptive as the S4, as it's a matte finish and not a chrome one like on that phone, which really makes it look like metal, only for it to feel cheap as soon as you picked it up. It makes both the S3 and S4 very light phones, almost too light, and the S3 really just doesn't feel like the flagship it was supposed to be in 2012. But again, this is coming from an avid iPhone user, and it's all down to personal preferences. If you love the design of the Galaxy S3, that's totally fair, and the accessibility of plastic is admittedly extremely convenient. This plastic back easily pops right off and gives access to the 2100 mAh battery, a good size for the time, and if you do end up killing it, you could always go ahead and swap that battery with a spare within seconds. This was a huge appeal for early Galaxy phones, and it would continue to be with the S4 and S5 until Samsung went ahead and imitated the iPhone with a premium and beautiful design in the S6, but with the downside of a lockdown and inaccessible experience. I do think the S7 managed to find a reasonable compromise, adding back especially the SD card slot, which this phone also has, but regardless, there's no question that the Samsung of old was very much its own thing, not trying to bow to the trends of competitors in the same way that they might do now. Not that I have anything against newer Galaxy phones, I just really want to emphasize how unique early Samsung was. They didn't try to be something they weren't. They made a solid plastic phone that they knew people would like, and sure enough, people liked it. It was definitely expensive for a plastic phone, but users knew what they were getting into and the benefits of said price point. However, I also don't want to completely disregard the flaws of the Galaxy S3 because they most certainly exist. While the display was one of the best for 2012 and the technical specs were top of the line, the problem that has always dogged Samsung from the beginning was in its prime with this device. The horrible, awful, no good, very bad software. Maybe that's exaggerating things slightly, but only slightly. The TouchWiz interface has to be some of the most confusing, terrible software ever designed, being a bloated, slow, ugly skin over Android 4.3 Jelly Bean or 4.4 Kit Kat on better variants of the S3 that contain more RAM, such as the one I have here. Not that the software version even particularly matters, because back in these days, the operating system always felt more Samsung than Android. You've got the duplicates of all your apps as per usual with Samsung devices, as they're required to include the Google apps but always want to throw in their own, and then you also have a huge number of really unnecessary apps and bloat that does nothing to better the experience, not to mention the feature set. There's a variety of typical junk that Samsung threw in here that vary from actually kinda neat, like water rippling on the lock screen, to unusable like S-Voice, Samsung's attempted competition to the new at the time Siri. It really is bad and is closer to Apple's voice control, like on the iPhone 4, than actual Siri. It's pretty crazy how far virtual assistants have come, and we'll avoid talking about Bixby. But some of the bloat here, like I have an app called Paper Artist. What does that even mean? There's Group Play, Samsung Link, a VPN client, of course the Galaxy Store along with the Play Store, Dropbox, and Flipboard are pre-installed, and I don't really have issues with either of those apps, but I don't think they need to come with the device. And then this isn't really Samsung, but you also have Google Plus and Hangouts, which is kind of funny. The duplicates of apps though is kind of ridiculous. Not only do you have a Google app and then Chrome, you also have just internet. Then not only do you have settings, you also have Google settings. Then you have separate apps for play books, play games, play movies and TV, the Play Music, Play Newsstand, and then of course the Play Store. That is Google, that's not Samsung, but it's still kind of silly. You have a dedicated video app that Samsung included, which actually does allow for some picture-in-picture stuff, which is neat and ahead of its time, but as far as I can tell, you have to do it through this app, which isn't great. And then not only do you have S-Voice and a voice search, you also have voice recorder. All these apps, it's just confusing for the average person who wants to go into their phone and do something. And a lot of it's really redundant. Why do you need to have a separate voicemail app from your phone app? It's just typical old Android stuff, and a lot of this has been fixed over the years as Android has continued to get better and better. There's lots of quirks with this device, but one thing I want to talk about, the other variants of the Galaxy S3, because there's a lot of them. It's confusing. The Galaxy S3 has had a ton of different versions released, with 16 different model numbers featured on the Wikipedia page that gives a full-on detailed chart. Most of the different models were made for reasonable means, being for different regions or carriers, so that's not unexpected. But then there's also the elusive 2nd gigabyte of RAM that wasn't in the original model for some reason, initially selling in Japan at the same time that you would buy a Samsung Galaxy S3 with a single gigabyte of RAM in the US and internationally. And then the next model would slowly spread. The quad-core Exynos processor in the single gig of RAM models would be replaced with the Snapdragon S4 chipset to allow for 4G LTE connections. So while the very first model can't do 4G, most others can. And it creates this very odd split in the Galaxy S3's history, as the weirdness doesn't end there. In 2014, Samsung released the Galaxy S5, and following that would launch the Galaxy S3 Neo, which held a quad-core Snapdragon 400 processor, along with 1.5 gigs of RAM and 16 gigabytes of internal storage. It is mostly the same as the Galaxy S3 and really just existed as a budget option to the S5 at the time, but they called it the Neo for some reason. I'm not sure why they couldn't just keep selling the S3 at a reduced price, but that's what they decided to do. And then there was also the Galaxy S3 Mini, because of course there was. Coming out in late 2012, about 6 months after the S3, and being similar with some downgraded specs and a whole nother plethora of variant models stemming from it over the years. This is all something that early Samsung really had trouble with: consistency and clarity in their lineup. It was confusing buying a Galaxy with so many options that were all so similar but different from each other, and changing the specs so quickly after release just seems odd, even if 4G was starting to get popular quickly. Not only does it screw over the people who bought the S3 right away because they got the lesser device compared to most of them, but it also leaves the consumer lost on what to purchase when they Google the Galaxy S3 and find half a dozen different variations of it, versus if they look up the iPhone and they simply see the iPhone 4S and that's it. Even today, Samsung suffers from this to an extent, with a ridiculous amount of different smartphone models, all priced and named differently from each other, and many of them looking quite similar. I won't get into that in today's video, but I do think it's something worth mentioning, as it could even be seen nearly 10 years ago, as well as today. Samsung loves to give as many choices as possible, but they've also never been great at being clear about how those choices differ from one another. And in the S3's case, with the Neo and the Mini and the regular S3, but then there's also the better S3, it's just a bit of a mess. And regardless, odds are in 2012, people just walked into their local cell phone store and bought a Galaxy S3 without much of a thought of which specific model number they were getting. And if you were to get the first one, you would only be getting a couple years of updates, from Android 4.0 Ice Cream Sandwich to Android 4.3 Jelly Bean. If you had one of the better models, you would get Android 4.4 Kit Kat, released initially in late 2013, as opposed to Jelly Bean, which Google released in 2012. So that means you weren't even getting 2 years of updates in some cases, an abysmal number that might have been common for many Androids, but still should not be excused under any circumstance. And you can really feel the age. This is not a slow phone per se when it comes to the basics and swiping around the UI, but the visuals are unholy levels of dated, with the terrible pseudo-realistic look that tried to imitate Apple, mixed with the flatter aesthetic of Android that they'd always be known for. One thing I do appreciate is the default dark mode within many of the system apps, such as the settings, and that's just how it is, with no toggle to switch to light mode. There's definitely a charm to the older TouchWiz Android 4.4 interface, but it's a charm that can only cover for the downsides of the old software for so long. Good luck using modern apps or trying to do anything you might want to do nowadays, except for maybe email, texting, calling, and so on, as the S3 could serve perfectly well enough, so I'll give it that. Although if you have the original, you won't be using 4G, you need the 2 gigs of RAM to do that, and the Snapdragon chipset. I'll also admit that the software really isn't too different from Android a decade later. Sure, it looks completely different, I would say a lot better nowadays in my opinion, but all the basics from the app drawer power to the slide-down control center are still here, and it's quite impressive how basically most smartphones since the first iPhone from 2007 have actually held up well in this regard. They all typically have some form of the grid layout on the home screen, have a lock screen, and it works. There's a reason things haven't really changed within the past decade and a half, besides, designs and little things, of course, to make it better, but the core experience is still there. So how about the camera on the Galaxy S3? Well, it's nothing to write home about, but it was obviously one of the best existing about a decade ago. The rear sensor boasts 8 megapixels, the same count as the Galaxy S2, along with 1080p video recording. Looking at that video recording, it definitely works, but may not look 1080p. With that typical pixelated shaky playback we can all associate with older smartphones. The photos are absolutely of the era, and pretty bad in modern context, but with good lighting outdoors, I think it's fair to say you can in the very least get half-decent shots. And don't forget, back in the days when people were just starting to move on from flip phones, something like this would have been miles ahead of their old Motorola Razr. Move indoors though, or into any even slightly low light situation, and that quality drops off hard and fast, with grainy, blurry, messy images, as one would expect from a phone camera of this age. The selfie cam on the S3 is 1.9 megapixels, and yeah, this sure is a selfie. About all there is to it. Basically, the S3's camera did the job during the time it needed to, but I certainly wouldn't want to use it anymore. When it comes down to it, this is just a plastic Samsung phone from 2012, but one that managed to really thrust the company into the limelight, being the main competitor with iPhone moving forward, as Samsung really upped their marketing and trying to show just how far ahead they believed themselves to be compared to Apple devices. This ad here is quite amusing, where it's a bunch of iPhone users waiting in line to get the brand new iPhone 5, while there's a couple Samsung users saving spots for other people, showing off how much better their phones are. It's a dumb, silly ad, and is clearly flawed in a lot of its reasoning, but I still like the gumption of Samsung to try something like this. It's almost reminiscent of what Apple did to IBM when they were the little guy. Not that Samsung was ever really an underdog by any means, but you get the idea. This was a different time for Samsung, and I would say the S3 really kicked off their glory days. Can you use the Galaxy S3 nearly a decade later? I mean, kind of. When it comes to the basics, I suppose so, but there's no reason you'd want to, that I can possibly imagine. And really, the S3 best serves nowadays as a nostalgic piece of the past that should probably stay in the past. It was a great 2012 phone that would have been the first touchscreen device for many a user coming over from a flip phone, or perhaps the first big smartphone for a lot of people, and I'm sure it gave many users a terrific experience that has them look back on the device fondly. It sold so well for a good reason. It's a fun phone to look at, and as always, I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, maybe hit that like button, and if you're feeling generous, consider subscribing for more content just like this. You can follow me over on Twitter and Instagram at 91_tech if you'd like to for some reason, and we do have a Discord, of course, link in the description. With that all being said, thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. I'm Josh from 91tech, and I will see you all next time.